In this video, we are going to look at the structure of the brain as well as the functions of the various lobes. Let's get started. So here is a mid-sagittal section of a brain, and we are actually looking at the right half of the brain. There are a lot of stuff that we haven't learned yet, but let's go through some of the things that we've talked about so far. So here you can see the skull, right, which protects the brain, and underneath the skull, you can see the meninges. Okay, so there's three layers of the meninges. We can see the dura mater separating to form the durovenous sinus. That's where the CSF are drained. Beneath that, we have the subarachnoid space, the arachnoid matter, that is filled with CSF, and this white layer that goes around the brain, that is, of course, the pia mater. Okay, then we see the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of white matter that connects the two hemispheres, and below that we will always find our lateral ventricle. But of course, the lateral ventricle is much deeper and much bigger than what we can see here. It's actually a C shape, as you might remember, with a little tail projecting at the end, and much of the lateral ventricle is within the cerebrum itself. And we can see that there are these choreplexes, which are vascularized tissue that produces CSF, and it's going to go into the third ventricle, down the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, it is going to go down the central canal of the spinal cord. And over here you can see there is an empty space in the skull. That is actually from lecture 4, right, long time ago. That is going to be one of the sinuses that you have in the within the skull, right? That helps you to warm and moisten the air that we breathe. And that's pretty much what we learned so far. And we're going to come back to this picture again and again as we learn more of the brain parts. So let's talk about the cerebrum. Yeah, the cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain. So in this picture, this whole thing is basically your cerebrum. Okay, it's the part that you imagine when I say think of a brain. Okay, so when you think of the brain, the bulk of the brain, that's what the cerebrum is. The cerebrum is the last center to receive sensory input, carry out integration before commanding voluntary response. So what that means is, if we go back here to a few slides ago, all the sensory information that we receive throughout the body, okay, whether it's sensory information related to touch, to pain, to sight, to sound, all of them eventually is going to end up in the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebrum is basically the gray matter of the brain, the outer portion of it, and that's where you're going to have higher order processing of this information. The interneurons in this area are going to integrate the information before commanding a voluntary motor response. Okay, so think about the burning of the hand again. Okay, you touch the hot surface, you remove your hand. That's a reflex. Okay, there was no conscious thought or no thinking involved in that action. Okay, and then all the things that you do afterwards, like putting your burnt hand under running water. Okay, maybe you try to blow some air into it. Maybe you want to put some ice pack on. All those extra things that you do comes from higher order integration that occurs within the cerebrum, and those are all voluntary motor responses. Of course, the cerebrum does not work alone. It communicates with many other parts of the brain, and the cerebrum is where higher thought processes are going to be carried out, and all these higher thought processes are of course required for learning and memory, as well as language and speech. So exactly which part of the cerebrum does what, that's pretty much what this section of the lecture is about. So here you can see the entire brain. Again, this whole thing here, okay, this whole thing is going to be the cerebrum. Okay, the cerebrum, which makes up the bulk of the brain. Now you can see the brain is not supposed to be smooth. Okay? In fact, if you have a smooth brain, That's typically a sign of having some kind of pathology. If you think about like an Alzheimer brain, Parkinson brain, right, all these things at the end stage of these diseases, the brain appears to be quite smooth, and that's because neurons are dying in these diseases, and that's what gives the brain the smooth appearance. So you don't want a smooth brain, okay? You want a brain that has a lot of bumps and grooves in it. So the bumps, right? A bump in the brain is what we call a gyrus, and you have many gyri in the brain. A groove is called a sulcus, and the plural of sulcus is sulci. Okay, so all these lines here, those are the sulci, and then all these bumps, right? They are the gyri. So the cerebrum is divided into two halves by a very long fissure, and here in the frontal section here you can see part of the fissure. That is called the longitudinal fissure. If you look at the brain from the top, and I have a better diagram coming up later, but if you look at the brain from the top, you're going to see that there is a long line that goes from the front to the back. That's basically the longitudinal fissure. Okay, so that divides it into the left and right cerebral hemispheres, and if you stick your hand into this longitudinal fissure, you are going to hit the corpus callosum. Okay, so we have been talking about the corpus callosum for quite some time now, but here you can see it much clearer. That's the corpus callosum, and you can see the big gap here is of course the lateral ventricle, and the corpus callosum is a bundle of white matter that allows the two halves of the brain to talk to each other. Okay, in the coronal cut here, in the frontal cut here, you can see this is the corpus callosum, right? And it's actually fanning out with all these axons that would allow again the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. In some cases of epilepsy, epilepsy is basically uncontrolled neuronal firing. In some cases of epilepsy, to prevent the seizure from spreading from one brain to the other, from one half of the brain to the other half, in some patients, they actually would cut part of the corpus callosum to interrupt the communication between the two halves of the brain, and therefore as a way to control the seizure. So the cerebral cortex, okay, so in a lot of organs, it's separated into the outer layer and the inner layer, and the outer layer is typically called the cortex. So the cerebral cortex is basically the outside of your cerebrum, and as we learned earlier, for the brain, the outside is gray matter and the inside is white matter. So the cerebral cortex is a thin but highly folded, convoluted layer of gray matter, okay, and it's going to cover the entire cerebral hemisphere. The cerebral cortex contains over 1 billion of cells, cell bodies, and that is the region of the brain where you will be able to process information like sensation, voluntary movement, as well as all the thought processes we associate with consciousness. Basically, the cerebral cortex of the brain is what makes us human. So in the brain, there are many sulci, but there are a few ones that are kind of landmark that we use to separate the brain into different lobes. The individual folds are going to be different in different brains, okay, because of our experience are going to be different, so how the brain is wired are going to be a little bit different. But then there are these key grooves that we all have in our brains, and we're going to label that in the diagram right now. So back to our workbook. Here is a very simplified diagram of a brain, and so we all have this very prominent groove that runs down kind of in the side of the head right here, and that is called the central sulcus. Okay, central sulcus. Right? So the central sulcus separates the brain into the frontal lobe, Okay, I'm going to outline the frontal lobe for you. And here is the central sulcus that I'm going through right now. So the central sulcus separates it into the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, which is right here. Okay, so let me label those for you. And you should be doing this with me together. Over here, see, that's the frontal lobe. Okay, so what does the frontal lobe do? I'm just going to give you a few examples. That's where speech occurs. Speech, voluntary movement, complex thoughts, higher order thinking, like math, abstract stuff, like time, for example. All those higher order thinking occurs in the frontal lobe. Personality. Okay, so all these things are associated with the frontal lobe. So at the back of the frontal lobe, just in front of the central sulcus, is going to be a special region. Okay, so this special region is called the precentral gyrus. Okay, precentral gyrus. Basically, is a bump that is in front of the central sulcus. Okay, precentral gyrus, and on this precentral gyrus, it contains a very important functional area. Okay, it contains the primary motor cortex. And that's where all voluntary movement originates. Okay, so if you want to move your right hand, it is going to come from the primary motor cortex on the left side of the brain. If you want to move your left leg, that command is going to come from the primary motor cortex on the right side. So this primary motor cortex is found on the precentral gyrus. Okay. At the back here, right behind the frontal lobe, we are going to have the parietal lobe. Okay, parietal lobe. That's what G is. Parietal lobe. Okay. So parietal lobe, the function is it will process sensation. So that would be things like touch, pain, texture. Okay, so all that stuff, right? When you touch the hot surface, when you touch a sharp object, that information is going to travel up the ascending tract, ultimately ending up in the parietal lobe here. Now, at the front of the parietal lobe, behind the central sulcus, is another important region. Okay, so this region, this is called the, you probably can guess the name, is the post-central gyrus. Okay, and this post-central gyrus contains another important area. Right? It contains the primary somatosensory. Somato means bodily, right? So these are bodily senses. Cortex. Yeah, cortex is basically a defined functional area that have a particular purpose. So at the primary somatosensory cortex, you would be able to feel sensations from different parts of the body. So if you burn your left hand, then that burning sensation is going to arrive on your right primary somatosensory cortex. Right? If you step on Lego on the right foot, you would be able to send that sensation all the way to the left side of the primary somatosensory cortex. Another interesting thing about the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex is that the cortex itself is going to be zoned into different areas. It's probably easier if I show you in the PowerPoint. So over here you can see this is the primary motor cortex, and this is the primary somatosensory cortex. Sorry, the color are kind of reversed from what we label on the diagram, but it conveys the same information. So it's zoned into different things, right? So we have the face in one region, the hand in another region, and then the trunk of the body. So if I were to put these labels on a diagram, and I mean, you don't have to know the precise order for the test, but it's kind of good to put it on the diagram to see what that means. So you would have the face here, and then you would have the hand here, right? So that means if your right hand touch something sharp, right? Sure, you're gonna have your spinal reflex removing your hand, but that information will ultimately light up this part of the brain. Okay, and then it's going to communicate with this part of the brain so that you can do something to your right hand. Okay, and each region is going to be zoned to different parts of the body. So if someone has a stroke, say right here, right, then they will not be able to voluntarily move their right hand, but they can still have feelings from it. Conversely, if the stroke occurs at here, then they won't be able to feel their face on the right side, but they can still move the facial muscle. Okay, so that's basically what the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex are for. Okay, one is for feeling, one is for voluntary movement. Okay, let's take a look at other lobes. At the back here, we have an occipital lobe. Okay, occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe is located at the back, and the main function of the occipital lobe is for to process visual information. Okay, so visual. Right? So anything you see from the eyes is going to get projected to the visual cortex located in the occipital lobe, and we will learn more about that in the sensory organ unit. On the side here, we have another lobe. This is the parietal lobe. Okay, so parietal lobe right here. And just for reference sake, your ear is about here. Okay, so that's where your ear is, and then this would be the location of the temporal lobe. Okay, so temporal lobe is a temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is responsible for things like smell and hearing. Okay, smell and hearing. Right. There is actually a fifth lobe kind of behind the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe called the insula, and that's where taste goes. We'll learn more about it in the lecture 7. Right. So B here points to another sulcus. This is called the lateral sulcus. Okay, sometimes it's called lateral fissure. Fissure sulcus is similar. So those are the different lobes and the functions associated with it. There are a few other things here that we can label. We'll label it first, and then we'll learn about their function later on. At the back here, we have the small brain. Okay, that is called the cerebellum. Cerebellum. Okay, so just kind of know what it's called for now, and we'll learn what it does later on. There's a little bulge here that's called a pons. It's called a pons. And over here we have the medulla oblongata. Okay, so just to help you reorient yourself, I'm going to go back to this diagram, and here you can see this is the cerebellum. This is the pons. Right? So between the pons and the cerebellum, that's where you will find the fourth ventricle. Okay, pons, cerebellum. All right. Okay, back to the PowerPoint slide for now. As we mentioned, that the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex are zoned into different regions, and most of it is going to be on the lateral surface, but it does extend into the longitudinal fissure as well. And this picture here is basically what we look like to our brains. Okay, if we were to draw the body parts proportional to the number of neurons that goes to and from those parts of the body, that's what we would look like. So we have a lot of neurons going to and coming from the hands, and that's why they're so big, and not as much from, say, the trunk of the body. And for some reason, we have a lot going to and from our lower lips as well. Okay? So, for example, if a person is blind, they use their fingers to read the brailles, right? And we can do that because there's a lot of sensory neurons going to the fingertips. Okay, so there's an experiment you can try with a friend or something, with a family member. You can blindfold the person, and you can try to poke the person's fingertip with 2 pencils. Okay, you can either poke them with 1 pencil, or you can try to poke them with 2 pencils, with the tips really close to each other. Okay, and you would ask the person whether you're poking them with 2 pencils or if you're poking them with 1 pencil. Okay, so typically the person will be able to tell you 100% of the time whether it's 1 pencil or 2 pencils. And then you're going to try this exact same thing, but at the lower back here. Okay, and they won't be able to tell whether it's 1 pencil or 2 pencils. That's because we don't have the sensory resolution at the lower back as we do in the fingertips. We don't have as many neurons going to and coming from that area to allow us to distinguish the fine point of 2 pencils, or if it's 1 pencil. So that is something that you can definitely try at home. Here is another view, right, of the mapping of the primary motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. And again, damaging one region would only affect the function related to that portion of the body. Okay, if you damage here, then you won't be able to move the face, one side of the face, anyways. And if you damage here, then you won't be able to feel the face. Okay. This is the description of the primary motor cortex and primary somatosensory cortex. I'm not going to read it to you. It's basically what I've been telling you for the past couple minutes. So go ahead and read that yourself. Now, before we move on, I do want to go back to the workbook a little bit more. There's another diagram that we should label together. It's actually just on the next page. This is a top view of the brain. This is your nose, so that would be the front of the head, and this is the back. So you can see right down the center, right, this big groove, that is the longitudinal fissure. A longitudinal fissure. Okay, and that divides the two hemisphere, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Okay, and so you can see that over here there is, just make it more obvious, there is the central sulcus. Okay, and the central sulcus will divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, right? Just like what we said in the previous diagram. So I'm going to shade in the frontal lobe for you. Okay, so you can see the frontal lobe, and at the back of the frontal lobe, that's where you will have the primary motor cortex. Okay, so that's right here, primary motor cortex. And the primary motor cortex is located on the precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus. So you might wonder, right? Like on the test, do I label this as precentral gyrus or do I label this as primary motor cortex? If I asked you for the functional area, then you tell me it's the primary motor cortex. Okay. If I asked you for the anatomical name, then that would be the precentral gyrus. Okay. And at the back here, we have the parietal lobe. Right? We have the parietal lobe all the way to maybe around there. And at the front of the parietal lobe, that's where you will have the post-central gyrus. Okay, so right there, that's the post-central gyrus, and the function, it contains the functional area, the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay? Post-central gyrus. Okay, so that's the anatomical name, and the functional area that you will be able to find on the post-central gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. Right? So this here is the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe for speech, higher order thinking, and voluntary movement. And this is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe, which is for processing sensory sensations, right, from throughout the body. G is pointing at a bum, so we call a bum a gyrus. And H here is pointing at this lobe at the back, and that we can see a little bit of it here. That would be the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe, and the function of the occipital lobe is to process visual information. Occipital lobe. Okay. Over here, I believe is pointing at the grooves. So those are the sulci. Okay, it's pointing at two. So plural sulci, singular is sulcus. Actually, over here it's pointing at two of them. So it should be gyri as opposed to gyrus. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of where things are, right? We have several views, top views, side views, okay? And you can kind of flip back and forth between these two diagrams to have a better view at them. So here's another diagram of the brain with the lobes and more detail about what each lobe does. But I want to focus on these things called the association area. So there is a somatosensory association area in the parietal lobe. There is the visual association area in the occipital lobe, and then there is the auditory association area. So what is an association area? Well, basically, association areas are places where integration occurs and where memories are going to be stored. Now, these are integrations for senses that are related to a particular function in that lobe. So for example, if we're talking about the somatosensory association area, then that area is responsible for processing and analyzing sensory information from the skin and muscle. And for the visual association area, then these would be processing information and memories related to visual information. So let me give you an example of how this works. Okay, let's say you see someone's face, right? The image of that person's face is going to be processed in the visual association area in the occipital lobe, and then you're going to match that face with all the faces that you know in your brain, and maybe you can recall the person's name. Okay, and if you don't have that memory, if you don't have a memory of that face, and you're meeting the person for the first time, then in that area, in the visual association area, that's where you will form a new memory related to that face. Okay, so the association area is where you will process a certain type of sensory information related to that lobe, and you are going to create memories related to those sensory input as well. Another example of this would be in the auditory association area, where if you set a specific ringtone for a certain person, like your spouse calling you, you would have a special ringtone for him or her. Then every time you hear that ringtone, the auditory association area will recall that memory and know that who's calling. And if it's a new sound that you haven't heard before, and you want to associate it with a particular meaning, that will also take place in these association areas. So there is something called the Broca's area, and then there is something called the Wernicke's area. Let's label these first in the diagram before we talk more about it. Let's go back to this this particular diagram. Okay, so this is the lateral view of the brain, of the left brain, and we are going to add a new area to it. Okay, so the Broca's area is on the left lobe for a majority of the people. Okay, and it's located right here. Okay, right here. That is the Broca's area. Right, so let me put that down for you. Broca's area. Okay, this is the area of the brain that allows you to produce articulate speech. Right, so let's take a look at the PowerPoint slides for that. This is also called the motor speech area, and like I said, it's usually located in the left frontal lobe for most people. It allows you to basically coordinate with the primary motor area, the primary motor cortex, to use the different muscles, different respiratory movements and oral movements to produce articulate speech. Okay, so when we pronounce things, when we try to say things with the right syntax, all that is going to involve the Broca's area. If you damage the Broca's area, then it will interfere with the person's ability to speak fluently. Or in a proper manner. The person can still speak, but then the speech is going to be there's a lot of pauses, there are a lot of wrong words in the wrong place, and the syntax are going to be wrong as well. And this kind of a problem, we call it Broca's aphasia, okay, or expressive aphasia. Okay, so here is a transcript of someone with Broca's aphasia, and the person was asked to describe what's happening in the picture, and you can read the transcript. There are some pauses, and then there are some sentences that are fragment, and then you can see the thoughts are not really flowing. Okay, so you might not understand what the person is saying. Okay, but you know, if you are close to the patient, if your family member, for example, you know, if you live with them for long enough, then you probably will be able to understand what they mean when they use certain words in certain contexts. But you know, if you met the person for the first time and they have Broca's aphasia, you would have trouble understanding them. Another area that's important for human communication is the Wernicke's area. So in order for you to understand what other people are saying to you, as well as to understand written message, you would need the Wernicke's area. And just like the Broca's area, this is typically located on the left side of the brain. If you damage the Wernicke's area, you won't be able to understand a written message, and you won't be able to understand what other people are saying to you, even though it's a language that you know. And this is called Wernicke's aphasia, or receptive aphasia. Okay, so if you damage the Broca's area, you have trouble expressing yourself, and if you damage the Wernicke's area, then you have trouble understanding, right? Receiving what other people are saying to you, or what's written on a piece of paper. So both Wernicke's area and Broca's area will work together to allow human communication. Let's quickly go to this diagram again, and we're going to add the Wernicke's area this time. It is located somewhere here. Okay, in the temporal lobe, because after all, the temporal lobe is where auditory information is processed. Okay, so that is the Wernicke's area. Let me just add that for you. Wernicke's area. Okay.